Hey everyone, how are you today? We will be starting a new unit and it's unit 4 in your economics syllabus. It is about the role of the government in a country, whether it was locally or even internationally. Our objective would be to analyze the role of the government locally, nationally, and internationally. Now, what do I mean by these terms? When I'm talking about locally, I'm talking about the government interfering on a smaller basis. So, for instance, it's when the government or a government organization with the authority to administer a range of policies within an area of the country. So it's a smaller base. However, this would create something called natural monopoly, which means there is only one single firm that is capable of producing that particular product at a much lower average cost. Okay, we'll explain this later on. When I'm talking about internationally, I'm talking about how this particular government has a relationship with other countries. So sometimes they create something called a trade bloc, which is a regional group of countries that remove trade restrictions between themselves. So in other words, they can have free international trade among them, which means there would be no tariffs, no quotas, which is they are exchanging goods and services without any restrictions. First of all, we need to understand what is the public sector. We already spoke about that before, and we said that the public sector, it means I'm talking about government intervention. So anything mainly that is owned and controlled by the government. So when I am talking about the public sector, it performs its functions. A government will need to be an employer. They will be the ones that employ the factors of production. They would also be a producer, and usually they create something called natural monopoly, which is usually governments in countries, they are the only ones that own the electric company, water company, the oil and gas in the country. So this is why we would call it a natural monopoly. And at the same time, they could be a consumer because they might be hiring private sectors in order to perform the projects for the government. And finally, the government would be acting as a regulator since it would be the one making the laws and regulations in a country. So in addition to civil servants, the public sector employees would usually include members of the armed forces, the police, the judiciary system in the country, teachers if I'm talking about the public school, doctors if I'm talking about public hospitals, and the nurses that work in the public hospital. Now, when I want to talk about the government as an employer, why would it be acting as that role? Because first of all, the government's aim is to decrease unemployment in a country. So the most important industries that are owned and run by the government, they are the electricity, the railway transport, and this, as we said before, we call it natural monopoly, which means that the private sector cannot be producing at a lower price. And then also the government would be providing housing, education, healthcare, and I would be calling that the essential products. So the government provides it for free or at subsidized or lowered prices. When I'm talking about local authorities, they are multi-purpose bodies responsible for delivering a broad range of services. So, for example, I'm talking about municipal governments run such services as the parks in the village or the city, the police, the fire, housing services, emergency medical services, the municipal courts, and public transportation services. Also, I would be talking about the government agencies that are responsible for delivering public services, such as the healthcare and the law enforcement. When a government is acting as a producer, first of all, the government is the one that owns the factors of production. So therefore, it will be producing public and merit goods that was discussed in Unit 2. And public corporations or state-owned enterprises, which was discussed in Unit 3 previously. So what does it do? It may run the airports, the banks, public transport in the country, the local TV stations of the country, power and water supplies. As a quick reminder, what are merit goods? They are goods that gives more benefit than we think. That means we're talking about merit goods. So for example, we'd be talking about education and healthcare. So mainly I would be talking about public schools and public hospitals. So demand would be less. The private sector production would be less. So in other words, I would say that they are underproduced. So the government will produce merit goods for the people, as we said before, usually that are less fortunate. When I'm talking about public goods, however, it is a good that is non-rival and non-excludable. So in other words, each and every person in the country would be benefiting from public goods such as streetlights, the parks, and the lighthouse. So usually private sector do not produce such goods because they would not yield to any profit. So there would be no incentive for the private sector to produce it. Therefore, there will be no production. And again, also they are underproduced. So who would be providing us with public goods? It is usually the government. When I'm talking about the government being a provider, it provides people with low incomes, children receiving free or subsidized dental services. It would be providing for the elderly people, and it would be providing for the private sector probably a subsidized amount of money for the research and development that they are doing. And usually they would support the agricultural sector in the country, which means they are support income of farmers. When the government is acting as a consumer, it is spending. What does the consumer do? They spend, or I would call that public expenditure. Why am I calling it public? Because it's related to the government. So the government, when they are spending, they have two different expenditures. I have something called current expenditure, and I want you to think of it as something called day-to-day costs. So they are ongoing. So mainly the government would always have to pay for wages and salaries of public sector workers. They would always have to pay the pensions and the payments for daily consumables such as pens and papers that are being used in the public sector. So this, I call it current expenditure. It's ongoing. However, when I am talking about the capital expenditure or investments, remember, so I'm talking about investments, this means it is a long-term impact. So they are not doing it on a daily basis. So for instance, when the government wants to build a road, dams, public schools or public hospitals, these are investments, and I call it capital expenditure. So what is the public expenditure? It accounts for a large share of total spending or aggregate demand in many economies. What does the term aggregate mean? Total. So, as we said previously here, when I am talking about, for example, the road, that would be a capital expenditure. When I'm talking about, for example, buying computer equipment, building airports, also that is an example of capital expenditure. However, when I am talking about current expenditure, let us give more examples about it. It would be, for example, welfare payments. When you are unemployed and the government pays you for a certain period of time, this is part of current expenditure. Okay? When the government is acting as a regulator, we said it means it is making the laws, so a lawmaker. Laws governing murder or violent acts, regarding the dumping of waste, regarding smoking in public places, misleading advertisements and discrimination. So the government is setting laws, and at the same time, they are regulating, so they are, in other words, controlling prices. We call that price controls, which is, for example, markets that produce undesirable outcomes. Who would regulate it? It is always the government. And also they are regulating the product quality, the health and safety issues, the treatment of animals, and so on. The government as a tax setter and collector. Who sets the tax in the country? It is always the government. And who is the one to collect the tax? It is also the government. And let's keep in mind that tax is the main source of finance to a government. So we pay taxes as citizens, and the government is the one that collects the tax. When I am talking about local, regional, and national government, I need you to think about this national government being central government. This means I'm talking about national government. So in other words, what are they doing? Macroeconomic management, which includes planning and decision-making on issues that affect the whole country. When I am talking about local and regional government, I am talking about decision-making on issues that affect the cities and the towns, so it's locally. Mainly I'm talking about municipalities, implementing national policies, laws, and regulations that would be on a regional level. So, for example, let us look at some examples regarding local and central governments. The local governments, I would like you to have a look at these, whereas the central government, I would like you to have a look at these examples. And as you can notice, here they are talking about, for instance, building and maintaining major roads and motorways. It means it's the central government, whereas here it's local road maintenance. So it's just inside the city or the village, a small road. This is what I mean by local, whereas central, it is affecting the whole country. Local, it is on a smaller basis. All right, thank you guys. That would be it for today. I hope you enjoyed the video. Have a lovely day.